Hello, everyone. One of my heroes in the Catholic Church is Jesuit priest Father James Martin. He is the editor of America Magazine. He's published several books, and he's just a brilliant theologian who factors everything he says through the prism of pastoral ministry. I'm very fond of him. And recently he wrote an editorial in the New York Times entitled, "Where is God in a Pandemic?" My original intention had been to link it in an email to all of you so you could read it on your own. But with copyrights being what it is today, that wasn't really possible. So what I'd like to do is to read to you the editorial because I think it's very compelling and the questions he raises are very interesting for our consideration. And then I'll give you a little bit of an interpretation. All of it meant to be a reflection as we move into Holy Week. He published this on March 22nd. Father Martin writes, "Last summer I underwent radiation treatment, and every time I passed through the doorway marked radiation oncology, my heart seemed to skip a beat. While I was in little danger, my tumor was benign, and yes, one sometimes needs radiation for that. I daily met people who were close to death. Every weekday for 6 weeks, I would hail a cab and say, 68th and York, please. Once there, I would stop into a nearby church to pray. Afterward, walking to my appointment in a neighborhood jammed with hospitals, I passed cancer patients who had lost their hair, exhausted elderly men and women in wheelchairs pushed by home health care aides, and those who had just emerged from surgery. But on the same sidewalks were busy doctors, smiling nurses, and eager interns, and many others in apparently perfect health. One day it dawned on me. We're all going to 68th and York, though we all have different times for our appointments. In just the past few weeks, millions have started to fear that they are moving to their appointment with terrifying speed thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. The sheer horror of this fast-moving infection is coupled with the almost physical shock from its sudden onset. As a priest, I've heard an avalanche of feelings in the last month: panic, fear, anger, sadness, confusion, and despair. More and more, I feel like I'm living in a horror movie, but the kind that I instinctively turn off because it's too disturbing. And even the most religious people ask me, why is this happening? And where is God in all of this? The question is essentially the same that people ask when a hurricane wipes out hundreds of lives or when a single child dies from cancer. It is called the problem of suffering, the mystery of evil, or the theocracy. And it's a question that saints and theologians have grappled with for millenniums. The question of natural suffering from illness or natural disasters differs from that of moral evil, in which suffering flows from the actions of individuals. Think Hitler and Stalin. But leaving aside theological distinctions, the question now consumes the minds of millions of believers who quail at steadily rising death tolls, struggle with stories of physicians forced to triage patients, and recoil at photos of rows of coffins. Why? Over the centuries, many answers have been offered about natural suffering, all of them wanting in some way. The most common is that suffering is a test. Suffering tests our faith and strengthens it. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, says the letter of James in the New Testament. But while explaining suffering as a test may help in minor trials, patience being tested by an annoying person, it fails in the most painful human experiences. Does God send cancer to test a young child? Yes, the child's parents may learn something about perseverance or faith, but that approach can make God out to be a monster. So does the argument that suffering is a punishment for sins, a still common approach among some believers who usually say that God punishes people or groups that they themselves disapprove of? But Jesus himself rejects that approach when he meets a man who is blind in a story recounted in the Gospel of John. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," says Jesus. This is Jesus' definitive rejection of the image of the monstrous Father. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus responds to the story of a stone tower that fell and crushed a crowd of people. Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you. The overall confusion for believers is encapsulated in what is called the Inconsistent Triad, which can be summarized as follows. God is all-powerful. Therefore, God can prevent suffering. But God does not prevent suffering. Therefore, God is either not all-powerful or not all-loving. In the end, the most honest answer to the question of why the COVID-19 virus is killing thousands of people, why infectious diseases ravage humanity, and why there is suffering at all is, we don't know. For me, this is the most honest and accurate answer. One could also suggest how viruses are a part of the natural world and in some way contribute to life. But this approach fails abjectly when speaking to someone who's lost a friend or loved one. An important question for the believer in times of suffering is this: can you believe in a God that you don't understand? But if the mystery of suffering is unanswerable, where can the believer go in times like this? For the Christian, and perhaps even for others, the answer is Jesus. Christians believe that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, yet we sometimes overlook the second part. Jesus of Nazareth was born into a world of illness. In her book, Stone and Dung, Oil and Spit, about the daily life in first century Galilee, Jody Magis, a scholar of early Judaism, calls the milieu in which Jesus lived filthy, malodorous, and unhealthy. John Dominic Crosian and Jonathan L. Reed, scholars of the historical background of Jesus, sum up these conditions in a sobering sentence in Excavating Jesus. Quote, "A case of the flu, a bad cold, or an abscessed tooth could kill," unquote. This was the world of Jesus. Moreover, in his public ministry, Jesus continually sought out those who were sick. Most of his miracles were healings from illnesses and disabilities, debilitating skin conditions under the rubric of leprosy, epilepsy, a woman's flow of blood, a withered hand, dropsy, blindness, deafness, paralysis. In these frightening times, Christians may find comfort in knowing that when they pray to Jesus, they are praying to someone who understands them, not only because he is divine and knows all things, but because he is human and experienced all things. But those who are not Christian can also see him as a model for care of the sick. Needless to say, when caring for someone with coronavirus, one should take the necessary precautions in order not to pass on the infection. But for Jesus, the sick or dying person was not the other, not one to be blamed, but our brother or our sister. When Jesus saw a person in need, the Gospels tell us that his heart was moved with pity. He is a model for how we are to care during this crisis, with hearts moved by pity. Whenever I prayed in that church near 68th and York, I would pause before a statue of Jesus, his arms outstretched, his heart exposed. Just a plaster statue. It wasn't great art, but it was meaningful to me. I don't understand why people are dying, but I can follow the person who gives me a pattern for life. Like all theologians, Father Martin is trying to say a lot. Most theology is a thought within a thought within a thought. But for me, when I read this editorial, what it says to me is that God is a mystery that we will never unravel, never completely solve. And that the world that we inhabit, as we have learned through the life and the death of Jesus Christ, is one in which there will always be suffering. Plagues, famines, economic breakdowns, suffering. And that somehow, in the midst of this suffering, we are not alone. That God is with us. And that somehow, in some mysterious and often unknowable way, there is something that we are meant to glean and to understand through the experience of suffering. I think the best theologians, they give us questions, not always answers. When I preach to you on Sunday, if I leave you with more questions than answers, I feel like I've done my job. So here's a question for you. Can we continue to have faith and trust in our God in the midst of this pandemic? I can, and that's why I'm here. I'm Matthew Pennington at Nativity of Our Lady in San Luis Obispo, California.